There's a strange story unfolding behind the scenes of the sneaker world, one that nobody saw coming. A mysterious storage unit quietly opened the door to one of the biggest Yeezy controversies ever, and the internet has been trying to make sense of it ever since. Somewhere inside a dusty, locked warehouse sat items that were never supposed to be seen, touched, or owned by anyone outside Kanye West's private circle. Not fan merch, not retail pairs. We're talking one-of-one prototypes, unreleased models, sketches, samples, and early concept pieces, artifacts that represent the evolution of Yeezy long before the hype ever reached the mainstream. And then, out of nowhere, they appeared. Photos started circulating online. Auction listings popped up with vague descriptions and cryptic language. Prices surged within hours, and sneaker collectors who normally chase hype suddenly realized this wasn't ordinary hype. This was history being auctioned off in real time, almost like watching someone sell the Mona Lisa piece by piece. But here, where things get strange. Nobody could answer the most important question. How did these items even get out? Was this an intentional release, a leak, a mistake, or something much messier? Rumors spread fast. Some people claimed Kanye abandoned the storage unit after failing to pay the bill. Others said the unit belonged to someone who used to work with him. Then whispers suggested the whole thing was actually tied to Adidas, adding even more confusion and fuel to the fire. And while the sneaker world argued, the auction house didn't slow down. Bids kept climbing. Collectors were willing to spend 5 figures, sometimes even 6, without hesitation. Not because they needed the shoes, but because owning one meant owning a piece of Yeezy's legacy, or maybe something even bigger. But then Kanye spoke. Suddenly, everything changed. His response wasn't casual, and it wasn't vague. He made it clear that the archive wasn't abandoned, and that none of this was authorized. If that's true, then millions of dollars worth of rare prototypes were being sold illegally. And if it's not true, then someone out there quietly walked away with one of the most valuable storage units in modern fashion history. If you're enjoying this video and loving the content, don't forget to give us a big thumbs up. It really helps us know what you want to see more of. And why keep all the excitement to yourself? Share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who loves NFL drama. Either way, the situation stopped being simple. Now it was personal, legal, and cultural all at once. The deeper people looked, the more questions appeared. Who really owns these prototypes? Can a creative archive be treated like abandoned storage? Is this lost property or stolen legacy? No one had the full story, but one thing was obvious. This wasn't just a sneaker auction. This was the start of a battle over ownership, creativity, and the future of Yeezy's place in cultural history. And the most shocking part, we still don't know how far this story goes, or who's actually telling the truth. If you ask the auction house, everything about this situation was simple, legal, and completely above board. From their perspective, this wasn't drama, it was business. They presented the archive as a significant cultural discovery, almost framing themselves as historians rather than sellers. The tone wasn't casual, it was curated. Their language felt intentional, strategic, and designed to establish legitimacy before anyone questioned where the items came from. In their official descriptions, the auction house stated the Yeezy pieces came from a legally obtained storage unit, implying that proper notice had been given, fees went unpaid, and the contents were forfeited. No ambiguity, no hesitation, just the standard storage locker process, the same one that turns forgotten garages into viral treasure hunts. But unlike old furniture and forgotten collectibles, this wasn't normal inventory. They emphasized rarity immediately. Prototype sneakers never released to the public, experimental materials, alternate colorways, early branding drafts, manufacturing tests, and personal reference pieces used during development. They positioned the archive as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for collectors, historians, and museums. Museums, not sneakerheads. That word choice mattered. They weren't selling this like hype. They were selling it like art. Then came the framing. They called the lot a documentation of the evolution of Yeezy, suggesting these items weren't just objects, They were evidence. Evidence of a creative process. Evidence of innovation. Evidence of Kanye West's influence on design culture. But here, where their claim gets interesting. Instead of just stating they had rights to sell the collection, they leaned heavily on narrative protection. Their messaging implied that the items were abandoned, forgotten, left behind, and therefore no longer personal, meaningful, or owned by anyone except them. They described the archive as previously stored and later released through standard contractual procedure. In other words, if someone wanted these items, they had every opportunity to prevent the auction. They didn't. That phrasing wasn't accidental. It was legal insulation. Still, even though they acted confident, they also acted cautious. They never named Kanye directly in the promotional language. They never stated he personally created or handled the items. Instead, they used distancing phrases like associated with the early development of Yeezy branding, believed to originate from creative testing and production stages, connected to the brand's developmental timeline. They implied, not confirmed. Because confirming ownership publicly could imply the items were still someone else's property. So, from the auction house's perspective, everything was clean. Everything was justified. They claimed legal access, cultural value, historical significance, and collector demand, all wrapped in a carefully worded explanation designed to sound bulletproof. But the moment Kanye responded, every word they chose suddenly mattered. Because now the world wasn't asking what they were selling. Now the question became, did they ever have the right to sell any of this in the first place? Just when the situation seemed chaotic enough, another major name entered the conversation, and their involvement changed the tone entirely. Adidas, once Kanye's most powerful business partner and now the very entity he split from in controversy, suddenly became an unavoidable part of the narrative. Why? Because if the archive truly contained early prototypes, concept shoes, testing materials, and unreleased designs, then legally those items might not belong solely to Kanye or to the person who opened that storage unit. They may, in fact, be tied to Adidas' intellectual property agreements. And that's where everything becomes murky. The partnership between Kanye and Adidas wasn't a simple endorsement deal. It was a multi-layered, multi-year licensing and design contract that involved manufacturing rights, trademark ownership, and co-owned product development. Meaning, some designs were Kanye's ideas, but Adidas funded the materials, production, testing, and sampling. In legal terms, that creates a gray zone. Who owns the prototypes? The artist who conceptualized them, or the corporation that manufactured and archived them? That depends on one thing, what the contract said. Nobody outside that relationship has seen the full agreement, but we know pieces of it. Multiple reports over the years described Adidas holding the rights to the Yeezy silhouettes and tooling. That's why, even after the public fallout, Adidas continued releasing Yeezy designs under different names and altered branding. Legally, they believed some or all of the physical sneaker designs were theirs. So if the auctioned archive includes early Yeezy Boost molds, sole structure prototypes, testing variants, manufacturing reference samples, then Adidas could argue these items were never private personal property. They were corporate assets. And here, where it gets even more complicated. Some of the pieces in the archive reportedly predated Kanye's Adidas partnership. Sketches and early blueprint samples linked to Nike era and even pre-Nike era Yeezy concepts. If that's true, those artifacts belong in a completely separate category altogether. Meaning the archive isn't just valuable, it's legally radioactive. If a storage unit contained both Adidas-developed proprietary prototypes and Kanye's personal concept materials, then someone, either Adidas, Kanye, or both, had reason to ask how those items ever ended up abandoned. Was the unit an official design archive? Was it owned privately by someone who worked on the Yeezy line? Or was it never supposed to leave corporate hands in the first place? Adidas hasn't issued a public statement, Not a denial, not a confirmation, not even a refusal to comment. Silence from a corporation that size isn't accidental, it's strategic. Their silence signals one thing clearly. They're watching. Because if any of those prototypes were manufactured under Adidas oversight, the auction isn't just a reseller transaction. It could be unauthorized liquidation of protected intellectual property. And that means this archive isn't just a collector's dream. It could be the beginning of a legal war. If there was one person everyone was waiting to hear from, it was Kanai himself. And when he finally did respond, it wasn't through a PR team, a formal legal notice, or a carefully controlled media statement. It was pure Kanai, raw, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Instead of denying, confirming, or clarifying, Kanai leaned into mystery. He shared cryptic posts online, hinting that the auction was less of a surprise and more of a warning shot. One message, according to people close to the situation, suggested the world had no idea what was really coming. Another hinted that certain pieces were never meant for the public, yet. To some fans, even those few words said everything. Because if Kanai truly had nothing to do with the archive, he could have simply shut the situation down with one sentence. It's not real. But he didn't. Instead, he layered speculation and left room for interpretation, almost intentionally. And then came what really ignited the conversation. Kanai reportedly contacted several individuals connected to the sale. Some sources say he demanded the items be pulled immediately. Others claim he wasn't trying to stop the auction, he wanted to control it. A few whispers online even suggested he might be planning to buy the entire archive himself. Not because he wanted the items back, but because he wanted to decide how and when the world would see them. It wasn't just about shoes or sketches or samples anymore. It was about legacy, ownership, narrative. To Kanai, these weren't random items tossed in storage. To him, they represented eras, ideas, experiments that shaped culture. Everything from the Nike Air Yeezy to the Adidas era to the unreleased Yeezy variations rumored to never see daylight. And there was one more layer, something even deeper. People close to Kanai said the archive wasn't just business. It was personal.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button.
Designs connected to his mother, notes tied to early creative breakthroughs, versions of models he scrapped at the last minute because they didn't feel iconic enough, versions Adidas allegedly rejected, only for Kanai to later prove the concept was genius. So when Kanai responded, it didn't feel like a star upset about lost property. It felt like a creator defending his blueprint. Someone protecting work he considered sacred. Someone refusing to let outsiders profit from something they didn't build. And yet, even after all the chaos, Kanai never offered a straightforward answer. Was the archive stolen, forgotten, sold by someone who shouldn't have had access? Or was this all part of something bigger? A reset, a reveal, a way of reclaiming history by letting the world debate it first. Because Kanai didn't just respond to the auction. He turned it into a storyline, one the world suddenly couldn't stop watching. Despite the warnings, the speculation, and the rising tension surrounding ownership and legality, the auction didn't stop. If anything, Kanai's mysterious reaction only added fuel. Instead of stalling the event, it accelerated interest. Collectors, investors, sneaker historians, and curious onlookers began treating the auction like a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle, the kind of moment culture only realizes was historic after it ends. As the bidding window opened, the energy online shifted instantly. What started as a quiet listing turned into a battlefield. Items that initially had modest estimates began breaking into five-figure territory within minutes. A prototype believed to be connected to early Adidas trials skyrocketed as anonymous bidders kept raising the stakes. Some listed pieces didn't even have descriptions, just vague phrases like Sample A or Version 3. Yet even those attracted intense bidding, fueled by mystery and what-if value. It wasn't just about shoes anymore. It was about owning a moment in cultural history. Every lot represented a breadcrumb from the evolution of one of the most influential creative eras in modern fashion. Early sketches with handwritten notes, alternate versions of well-known models that fans had only heard about in rumors, materials never released to the public, physical proof of trial and error, of genius in its messy, unfiltered form. And as prices climbed, the tone of the community changed. Some celebrated, others panicked. Collectors feared they were watching pieces slip forever into private vaults, never to be seen again. Meanwhile, legal experts quietly chimed in online, pointing out something important. Just because something sells doesn't mean the buyer fully owns it. Meaning this auction might not be the end. It could be the beginning of a dispute. Still, the bidders didn't care. Emotion was outweighing caution. People weren't just bidding with money, they were bidding with belief. Belief that these items held meaning. Belief that someday documents, interviews, or future releases would validate their importance. And then came the moment no one expected. Some items suddenly disappeared mid-auction. Listings vanished without explanation, no cancellation notice, no updated documentation, no public reasoning. The timing was suspicious. Some bidders claimed they received quiet messages saying certain lots were withdrawn due to verification review. Others said nothing at all. That only intensified the chaos. Were those pieces the most legally contested, the most personal, the most explosive? Or were they pulled because someone, possibly possibly Adidas, intervened behind closed doors? Even as parts of the archive evaporated, the rest kept selling, and the numbers didn't slow. The auction house didn't release a live public total, but insiders claimed the combined bids were staggering, easily into the millions. By the time the final lot closed, one thing was clear. This wasn't just an auction. It was a cultural power struggle conducted in real time, with bidders, corporations, and the artist himself all silently fighting for control. And yet, even with the auction concluded, the story was far from over. Because the bigger question still hung in the air. Would anyone be allowed to keep what they just paid for? Once the final bids were locked in and the auction officially closed, the energy around the archive shifted again, this time into something more unpredictable. The frenzy of real-time bidding faded, but what replaced it was arguably more powerful: speculation. Collectors, resellers, journalists, and fans started dissecting every detail, trying to understand not just what had sold, but what it meant. Because now the hype wasn't just about the items themselves, it was about everything surrounding them. Questions flooded social platforms and sneaker forums. Were the withdrawn lots the most important pieces? Were the sold items authentic prototypes or miscategorized samples? And perhaps the biggest question of all, would Canai or Adidas move to reclaim ownership now that the archive had changed hands? Nobody had answers, and that uncertainty did something unusual to the market. Instead of stabilizing, prices began to fluctuate wildly. People who managed to win auction items suddenly held something incredibly rare: proof, documentation, photographs, invoices. For a few days, those documents carried more weight than the items themselves because they hinted at what the rest of the archive might still contain. Sneaker investors started treating the sold pieces like early-stage crypto. High potential, high volatility, unpredictable trajectory. Some buyers listed items immediately for resale, hoping lightning would strike twice. Others locked theirs away, convinced they were holding artifacts that would only become more valuable with time, especially if controversy continued. Meanwhile, analysts began predicting multiple possible futures. In one scenario, Canai publicly confirms the archive's authenticity and acknowledges its importance. If that happens, the value could skyrocket overnight, transforming the pieces from collectibles into museum-level cultural artifacts. In another scenario, Adidas steps forward with legal documentation asserting the prototypes belong to them. That could freeze ownership, restrict resale, and plunge the market into legal limbo, which, ironically, could make the items even more valuable through scarcity and controversy. And then there was the third possibility, the one people whispered about the most. Rumors began spreading that Cannae might be planning something bigger, a documentary, a museum installation, a public archive project, something that would reframe the items not as random remnants of a storage unit, but as curated artifacts representing the evolution of his creative empire. If that rumor turned out to be true, the meaning of each auctioned piece would change instantly, from accidental discovery to fragment of a larger narrative. Collectors know one rule above all. Narrative controls value. And right now, the narrative wasn't finished. It was just beginning. The archive wasn't simply sold, it was released into the culture, out of storage, out of secrecy, out of silence. And as speculation spread, one thing became clear. People weren't just buying shoes, sketches, or prototypes. They were buying future history, before the world knew how important it might become. At this point in the story, one question hangs over everything. A question that nobody, not Adidas, not the auction house, not Cannae, not even the buyers seem able to answer. Who truly owns the legacy? Because what sold here wasn't just leather, fabric, foam, sketches, or samples. It was a timeline, a blueprint, a physical record of ideas that shaped culture, influenced design, and changed an entire industry. And that's where the debate gets uncomfortable, because legacy doesn't work the same way property does. You can sell an item. You can transfer ownership. You can put a price tag on materials. But can you sell creative history? Can you auction influence? Can you put a number on cultural impact? People started asking whether the archive belonged to whoever purchased it, or whether it still belonged, symbolically, emotionally, or historically, to the person whose imagination built it. Some argued the answer was simple: money talks. If someone legally bought the archive, then it's theirs, no debate. Ownership is ownership. Others pushed back. They said the items weren't just products, they were artifacts. They represented a movement in design, fashion, hip-hop, and identity. They argued these pieces should have been preserved in a museum, a foundation, or a public collection, not scattered across private vaults and climate-controlled storage. Then there was a third group, and their view was far more complicated. They believed the archive didn't belong to Cannae, Adidas, or the highest bidder. They believed it belonged to culture, to the people who lived during the Yeezy era, to those who waited in lines, entered raffles, and saved money for months just to own one pair, to the fans who didn't buy Yeezy because it was a shoe, but because it was a symbol of possibility. For them, the archive wasn't product inventory. It was history. Which brings us back to the question that now defines everything. What makes something valuable? The creator, the ownership, or the cultural meaning attached to it? Because depending on which answer you choose, the conclusion changes. If ownership defines value, the buyer's won. If creation defines value, Cannae still holds the crown. If culture defines value, then the archive belongs to everyone. That's why this auction didn't end when the hammer dropped. It ignited a debate that has no official judge and no clean resolution. A debate about authorship. A debate about legacy. A debate about whether cultural artifacts should be bought or protected. And until someone steps forward with clarity, Adidas, Cannae, the museum world, or the public, this story sits in a strange space. Not finished. Not closed. Not resolved. Just waiting. Because sometimes history isn't something you discover. Sometimes history is something you decide. So now we reach the bigger picture, the part of the story where sneaker culture, music history, corporate power, and personal legacy collide. Because this auction wasn't just about Kanye West, Adidas, or the people who walked away with rare prototypes. It was a reminder of something much larger. That culture moves forward whether the creators, the corporations, or the critics are ready for it or not. What happened with this archive exposed a fault line that has existed for decades, a tug-of-war between artistry and ownership. On one side, you have brands, contracts, and legal rights. On the other, you have emotion, influence, and the undeniable truth that some creations become bigger than the systems that manufactured them. This wasn't the first time a cultural artifact sparked debate. Michael Jackson's unreleased Demos, Tupac's notebooks, Basquiat's lost canvases. Whenever a creator leaves behind something unfinished or undocumented, the world instantly wants to decide what happens to it. Who protects it? Who profits from it? Who determines what it means? And every time, there's a common pattern. When the art becomes bigger than the artist, ownership becomes complicated. That's exactly what we witnessed here. Because whether someone loves or hates Kanye West, whether they agree with him, disagree with him, or don't know how to feel about him at all, his work shaped a moment in culture that can't be erased. Yeezy wasn't just a shoe line. It was a turning point in fashion. It changed silhouettes. It changed pricing. It changed the role of musicians in design. It made the sneaker world stop looking at athletes and start looking at artists. And once something changes the culture, it no longer exists in isolation. It becomes shared. It becomes lived. It becomes part of collective memory. Which brings us to the final truth. This auction wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A beginning of a new era where pieces of influence move outside the hands of the corporations that produced them and into the hands of the culture that felt them. A beginning of conversations about how we preserve creativity when its creator steps away, gets silenced, gets canceled, or becomes larger than the industry that originally accepted them. A beginning of something that may eventually force museums, brands, and public institutions to rethink the way modern cultural artifacts are handled. Because here's the twist. The archive never really left storage. It just moved from being physically locked away to being culturally unlocked. People are talking. People are debating. People are paying attention. And in the end, that might be the most valuable outcome, more valuable than resale prices, authentication debates, or bidding wars. Because culture doesn't survive through ownership. Culture survives through conversation. And this archive, intentionally or not, has sparked one the world wasn't ready for. Who gets to control history? The companies who produced it, the creator who imagined it, or the culture that made it matter? That answer isn't here yet. But the world is finally asking the question.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.